How can you use research in your daily life? This is a difficult question that I think a lot of people might think about if they are not in the research game. But if you are doing research and you are an academic or a researcher, you kind of know what what it's all about. And it's actually become so much part of your daily life that you can't think of anything else other than that thing that you're actually researching. So if you don't know me, I'm an associate professor of innovation strategy and entrepreneurship, and I created this whole reciprocity project to give back as much as I possibly can. There were so many people that helped me out that I wanted to pay the favor forward and help you out. So to qualify who I am in terms of doing research and stuff like that. So I have been doing research probably for more than almost half my life at this moment. Where I started in about 2000, the year 2000, 2001, where I did undergraduate research, and then I did a master's program. My undergrad's in chemical engineering, and then I did a master's in management science, and then I did research in a PhD program where I did research on innovation within the medical device industry. And now I am an associate professor at a large research school in Florida. You could probably guess which one it is, but I'm I do research for a long time. I've done it for a long time. It's now this video came out in the year 2020. And so if you're watching this in 2040, you know exactly when this came out. So with this, how does research actually become part of your daily life? As you learn about things, you absorb this new knowledge and it becomes part of who you are as an individual. It's kind of a difficult thing to sort of think about, but for me, because I study companies and I study innovation and businesses, in organizations, I really think of myself as a firm. I've thought about that for a long time, and we are sole proprietors, and we are generating different amounts of, for me in the research game, my primary product that I produce is ideas, but for other people it might be something else, right? So you can think of yourself as a sole proprietor where you are providing some goods and services to, whether it's your contractor that you are, so your employer, right? You might be sort of thinking about that you work for a larger company. Well, you are a sole proprietor for the larger company. You can view yourself that way. And you can think about ways that you can improve your performance and do better based on who you are as a sole proprietor, and sort of think about ways to leverage your resources that you have, right? So for me, in terms of my own research and what I do in terms of applying the lessons, once you learn knowledge, it's hard, you cannot forget it. It compounds on other knowledge. It really becomes part of who you are as an individual. So for me, I've learned a lot in terms of personal finance and personal growth, in understanding how I can manage myself and the people around me in terms of managing personal growth, in terms of how I manage a company and what I would come to expect in terms of what a good company would look like, in terms of good management would look like. And I try to view myself in that sort of way by allocating resources in certain ways where, I dedicate some time to research, I dedicate some time to marketing, and sales, right? That's basically what YouTube is. I dedicate some time to, building relationships. So actually communicating with my friends and family and co-authors and researchers and stuff like that. All of these activities are vital components of a firm, and they do the same thing, whether you are a firm of one or, a firm of 100,000, you have to do all of these things anyways. And so you have to think about how to balance these things going forward. And that's what I largely think about in terms of who I am, because I've studied this for so long. I actually just passed a milestone with reading, and I didn't count this before, but I have a large EndNote library, which is a reference library. And I've read over 3,000 books and papers, which is incredible. And all of that kind of gets absorbed over time. You start seeing a lot of patterns in the world around us, right? So that's only counting from the last 10, 15 years. That doesn't count all the stuff before that with looking at how much you absorbed. So the other thing is you really get an appreciation for science and what it means to do good science, and why it's actually so incredibly difficult, and why it's so incredibly frustrating, why scientists actually get really frustrated, both with the news media and sort of general public, is because they don't understand how difficult it actually is to get a good scientific paper published. And we're not looking often for like little tidbits and news bites and things like that. We're actually looking for fundamental knowledge that's far different, and it's hard to put that in a news bite. And so it gets really frustrating to get some of this stuff across and to sort of bridge the practitioner and the real practitioner world and what you do in research. It really is a tricky balance, because you do want to build fundamental science as much as you can, fundamental knowledge as much as you can. You also get a good sense of statistics in this in the world, in terms of that it's probabilistic, where the world is not as most people in the real world assume that the world is either rather fixed. And so they get really frustrated with scientists that are constantly changing their mind, that constantly kind of have it could be this, it could be that, and all of that kind of mentality, right? The pros and cons, and it's because science really recognizes that the world is not, it's not perfect, it's messy, it changes all the time, we get new knowledge all the time, and that's when science is actually doing the right thing, because they do disagree, and it's constantly changing, and it should be constantly changing. That is what that the world is actually working well. And then the other thing is that we assume that the world is fixed around us, like really fixed, right? We assume that there's a reality, like we know what a tree is, but that's not true. I mean, we only have this sort of perception, or this network of knowledge in our brain, to assume that is the tree in front of us. So we actually deconstruct this stuff in terms of thinking about, well, how does somebody know it's actually a tree? And if it's a tree, how come it's not this kind of tree? And then somebody like a scientist is going to, an arborist scientist is going to look at it. They're going to say, well, that's not a tree. That's that's a certain kind of tree. And don't you know the difference between this tree and that tree? And, the world is really, really complicated, and it changes all the time. And there isn't a fixed world out there like we tend to assume. And that was a really big thing for me in terms of who I changed, or how I changed in this world, is that realizing that the world is changing. There's really not a great, there's not a one thing. So we assume, a perfect example of this is we assume that, us, human beings, have a temperature of 98.6. But that degrees Fahrenheit. But that's not true. Everybody has their own independent temperatures, and they all vary and fluctuate over time. And every day your core temperature goes up and it goes down a little bit. And everybody has different ones. So there's huge there's the range around that, right? So it's not like there's a fixed thing that's out there that we assume that's out there. And understanding that is actually a really tricky thing, and sort of communicating that is a little bit of a tricky thing to the world around us. The other thing that you learn is about research designs, and thinking about critically testing things and exploring the world around you in terms of, how do you actually do this? Why do you have a control? Why do you, why do you do a pre-test, post-test, all these kind of different sort of things, and understanding what the world looks like in terms of research methods. And then, the other thing, so for me, what I want to come down to, so somebody just came to the door, but, the tricky thing that I want to come down to is that disentangling what you learn from graduate school, what you learn as a researcher, and what you learn from doing research, it is difficult to sort of disentangle that from your life. And as a researcher, as a scientist, as a professor, you're never going to be able to do this as a graduate student. You can't do that. In everything that you learn, in fact, there's a concept that we know in business, and it's made a huge impact in many areas, absorptive capacity. And it's this ability to absorb knowledge. And as you absorb knowledge, it sort of allows you to absorb more knowledge. And the more that we could do that, and the more that we actually do that, the more we actually learn, the easier it is to sort of put things together. So if somebody is like 85 or 90 years old and they're a career scientist and they've done this all the time, they are brilliant at that moment because they can sort of draw on all these things and put it all together and really make sense of the world like nobody else's business, right? As long as their cognitive capacity is there, and that's an important, it's an important constraint. But in general, we can expect that to happen. So it gets better, and you understand the world a lot more, and you understand how actually things work in this world. It becomes really fun. The other thing is that it really changes your relationship with your sense of self and who you are as an individual and what you think about as an individual. The world is never going to be the same after I've done this and sort of studied something where, for example, like religion, right? So you might have this sort of view of what religion is, but then you start listening or understanding the sociology behind it and the psychology behind it, and you're like, whoa, this is really powerful stuff. This is really cool. I would never assume that this was going on, or the history behind it. And you're like, I'd never assumed. So once you start taking a deep dive in all these different areas, you really get a sense of who you are and what's it about and where you come from, what are the institutions, about why you actually are the way that you actually are. It's really exciting and fun to know some of these things. So in general, I think, the important thing is that it has changed everything about how I understand the social, psychological, physical world along the way. And if you could think about education in general, once you do a year of kindergarten, you see the world so differently than if you did, and then you do another year of first grade and you're like, wow, I never would have thought of that. And then you do, second grade and third grade and fourth grade. And then all along that, you're like, wow, look at that. Well, that's so cool. This is amazing. You just think about things in so many different ways. And that's what it's like being a researcher and what you understand with research. It is so practical to get research knowledge. And people forget that. I think if you don't understand the fact that it's all building on top of each other and it's so incredibly practical, you kind of miss the whole point of why we're actually doing the things that we do. And hopefully this video explains some of that it is very much a building block thing. And you are getting better and you are understanding the world. This is very incremental, just like going from kindergarten to first grade, or first grade to the middle of first grade. It's incremental, but at the same time, you are seeing the world so differently. And what I would suggest, or this is what I think about, is that you get mind flips all the time where you're like, dang, that's a great idea. And all of a sudden your whole world changes. And you're like, dang, that's a great idea. Somebody thought of that. And you're like, oh man, I should have thought of that. And all of a sudden you have this mind flip where your whole world changes all the time. And this happens so much to do this. It happens just like it's almost every day where this happens. But then you have major ones, kind of minor ones, but major ones where you have these once a year, once every couple of years, where you're just like, I never thought of that. But so that's what I would think about in terms of the practicality of research. It is incredibly practical. You use it every day. It doesn't leave you. You make better decisions as you learn some of this stuff, and you understand why you do the things you do. So with that, give me a thumbs up to subscribe to the YouTube channel. Take care and have a wonderful day. Bye.